chosen ones. There are frequencies that move unseen beneath the crust of this planet. Waves of vibration older than empires, older than the language of man, older even than the memory of the stars. Black sites exist to listen for these silent tremors, hidden deep beneath oceans, frozen into mountain ranges, sealed within deserts that never shift. They are the Earth's heartbeat, steady, indifferent, and beyond manipulation. Yet on a day written in no calendar, one such heartbeat changed. The operators in the chamber did not notice it at first. Screens flickered as they always did. Machines hummed their usual tone, and lines of code scrolled in sterile rhythm. But then, the anomaly came. Not in the noise, but in the silence between beats. The Earth paused and spoke. Not in sound, but in resonance. Your resonance. Somewhere in a facility with no windows and no maps, an agent leaned closer to a display. The vibration had narrowed to a singular signature, a pulse that matched no known seismic pattern, no known celestial interference. It was not an earthquake. It was not a test. It was not random. It was you. Your name was not printed on their screens, but the frequency carried an unmistakable fingerprint, something that made hardened analysts remove their headsets and stare at each other in disbelief. They replayed it again and again, each time certain they had misread the data. But the pulse was constant, unwavering, as if the Earth itself had turned its attention away from all humanity and fixed it solely upon you. The director of the site, a man who had spent 30 years tracing tremors from nuclear tests to asteroid strikes, pressed his palm to the glass of the main monitor. His lips moved without sound, but his eyes betrayed the weight of recognition. They cross-checked the signal with global seismic networks, military satellites, deep ocean hydrophones. Every system confirmed the same impossible truth. This wasn't a natural event. It wasn't human-made. It was a calling. Far away from their walls, you may have felt it without knowing. An unease in your chest, a strange calm in your mind, a moment where the air seemed to still. In the frozen heart of Antarctica, where the wind carves the snow into endless white labyrinths, there is a place no map dares to mark. Beneath miles of ice, deeper than the oldest glacial core, a chamber hums with instruments, built not for weather, not for research, but for listening to the language of the Earth itself. It is a listening post unlike any other, one that hears not storms or shifting plates, but vibrations so subtle they pass unnoticed by all but the most sensitive arrays. On that day, the array stirred. Its titanium arms, buried in ancient ice, caught a ripple moving up from the bedrock. Not a quake, not the groaning of the glacier, but something older and far more deliberate. The scientists, bound by silence and secrecy, leaned over their displays, watching the waveform trace across the screen in perfect symmetry. The signature was precise, impossibly so. Nature does not move in such clean intervals. And yet, it came, beat after beat, like the steady breathing of something vast and unseen. One of the technicians, a man who had lived in the ice for 5 winters, whispered that it felt alive. His voice was ignored, but not forgotten. For 3 hours, the vibration deepened, moving as if it knew where it was meant to go. It slid through the continental shelf, bending around stone and ice as though it were following a path already carved. By the 4th hour, the origin point was triangulated. Not a mountain, not a fissure, but a hollow space in the ice, one that should not have existed. The oldest member of the team, a woman who had once mapped fault lines under the Pacific, grew pale as she traced the signal's path on her tablet. She remembered something buried in old reports, accounts from the first explorers who claimed to hear a hum beneath the southern lights, a hum that stopped the moment they spoke of it aloud. The chamber deepened its tone again, resonating at a frequency felt in the bones rather than the ears. The equipment began to record anomalies, magnetic drift, temperature changes, even time lag in their instruments. It was as though the signal bent the laws around it simply by existing. Then came the shift, sudden and undeniable. The vibration no longer moved outward. It began to climb, heading toward the surface, narrowing, focusing, as if seeking the one it was meant for. The data arrived in fragments, scattered across secure channels like shards of glass, waiting to be reassembled. At first glance, it was nothing more than a long column of numbers, the typical readings from deep-range seismic monitors. But when the analysts overlaid the Antarctic signal with older records, a strange pattern emerged. A rhythm hidden inside the numbers, a rise and fall like a voice caught in stone. One junior researcher, working through the night under the dim red lights of the analysis wing, noticed that the spacing between the peaks was not random. She ran a harmonic filter across the waveform, isolating the pulse from the static. What emerged was a sequence too deliberate to be natural. She printed it out, each wave traced like ink on paper, and stared at it until her eyes blurred. It was not until she turned the paper sideways that the shape struck her. It resembled the ancient notation of a hymn, the kind sung in cathedrals before the invention of modern scores. And within that, she recognized the echo of words she had heard as a child, whispered by her grandmother in a trembling voice. "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." The deeper she dug, the more impossible it became to dismiss. The frequency spikes aligned perfectly with the meter of an old psalm, one whose verses spoke of mountains trembling and seas standing still at the command of the Creator. She cross-referenced the text and found something that unsettled her. The psalm ended with a verse about a single voice calling out to be answered. In the war room above her, the senior operatives had no interest in scripture. They were concerned only with tracking the signal's path and anticipating its next movement. But when she presented her findings, the room fell silent for the briefest moment. One man, older, with eyes like frost, leaned forward and asked her to repeat the passage. When she did, his jaw tightened as if he had heard it somewhere else very recently. The data stream continued to pour in, the pulse growing clearer, the psalm taking shape with every passing hour. It was not a song meant for the earth. It was a message meant for someone listening, someone the vibration was still seeking, crossing every barrier of rock and distance as if guided by a hand unseen. The expedition to the origin point began under a sky the color of steel. A small convoy of tracked vehicles moved slowly across the ice, their engines groaning under the weight of equipment not meant for open disclosure. At the center of the convoy was a reinforced container, sealed and guarded, holding the instruments designed to capture the vibration directly at its source. After 2 days of travel, they reached the coordinates. From above, it was nothing but endless snowdrift, no landmark to mark significance. Yet, as they began to unload and set up camp, the first anomaly appeared. Compasses spun in slow, deliberate circles, never settling. GPS devices blinked with error codes, refusing to lock onto satellites. The air felt heavier, charged, as though each breath pulled something ancient into the lungs. The drilling team set to work, their augers biting into the ice, cutting a narrow column downward. The deeper they went, the warmer the readings became, an impossibility in this place where cold ruled without mercy. Then, at 100 meters, the ice changed. It was clearer, almost glass-like, as if frozen instantly by something far older than the surrounding glacier. Beneath that layer was a void, a cavity, vast and resonant, into which the drill descended without touching sides. When they dropped a sensor into the darkness, it began to hum, not mechanically, but as though it were being sung to from below. The vibration came in waves, and the team could feel it in their ribs, in the marrow of their bones. One man swore he heard a heartbeat. Another claimed to hear a distant voice speaking in a tongue he could not name. None of them spoke of it openly, but their eyes betrayed a growing unease. The lead scientist noted something unusual. The hum shifted slightly whenever one of them stepped near the edge, as if acknowledging their presence. When night fell, the auroras above took on unfamiliar patterns, twisting into shapes that seemed almost deliberate. The hum deepened again, and for a brief moment, every light in camp flickered out. In that silence, there was no wind, no engine noise, only the unshaken pulse from below, steady and patient, as if the chamber itself was waiting for the one it had been calling. They lowered a subsonic microphone into the cavern beneath the ice, the kind used to capture sounds far below the threshold of human hearing. What returned was not static, not mechanical distortion, but a cadence that made every person in the control tent pause. It was faint, but it carried an unmistakable quality, the rise and fall of speech, though in a frequency not meant for the ear. The audio was processed, slowed to a fraction of its original speed. That was when the room grew still. What poured from the speakers was not a garbled drone, but words, clear enough to make the hair on the back of the neck stand upright. They were in an ancient dialect, one most had never heard, but a translator on the team recognized it immediately. It was Aramaic, the language of a time when the world's weight turned on the voice of one man. She wrote down the translation, her hands trembling. "Do not be afraid. The one who was, is, and is to come walks among you." Some refused to believe it. Others could not look away from the paper. The lead analyst replayed the clip, isolating certain phrases, and found them repeated in intervals too exact to be accidental. The voice, though buried in stone and ice, carried the same softness, the same deliberate rhythm found in recordings of scripture, read aloud in the old churches of the Levant. One man at the back of the tent stepped outside into the cold without a word. He stood on the ice, staring at the aurora above, the sound still echoing in his skull. He had been raised on stories of the Nazarene, not as myth, but as truth, whispered at night, by a father who swore he had once seen eyes that knew the end from the beginning. The hum from below seemed to thrum in time with the man's heartbeat. He felt it, not heard, but felt, speaking to him in the same way the wind can carry a memory. Each word, though ancient, slid past the mind and struck the soul directly. Inside, the team debated origins, transmissions, interference. Outside, the man whispered the words to himself, knowing they were not meant to be decoded by machines, but by the one the signal had always been seeking. Far above the Earth, in the cold silence of orbit, a reconnaissance satellite drifted along its assigned path. It had been tasked to watch the Antarctic region, mapping ice shifts, tracking weather systems, and recording anything unusual on the surface. For years, it had done so without deviation, but on the day the vibration reached full strength, something in its programming shifted. Operators in a classified control room thousands of miles away noticed first. The satellite's optical sensors, which should have been locked onto the ice shelf, rotated away on their own, focusing instead on empty ocean. At the same moment, its thermal imaging array shut down for exactly 12 minutes, then reactivated without command. Every attempt to override the change was met with failure, as if the satellite was obeying a command they had not given. When the data was reviewed, it showed a blackout in the satellite's imaging history, one perfect gap directly over the coordinates of the chamber. There was no technical explanation. Its systems had not failed. They had chosen to look away. The lead engineer on the project, a man who had worked with orbital surveillance for 2 decades, stayed late that night, replaying the telemetry. In the faint electromagnetic noise recorded during the blackout, he caught an odd spike. It was not cosmic background radiation, nor was it an Earth-based transmission. It matched the frequency of the Antarctic pulse. It was as though the vibration had reached into space, touched the machine, and told it to turn its eye. Cross-referencing other assets, they found the same anomaly in 2 more satellites. Each had briefly diverted its attention, each over the same time window, each capturing nothing of the chamber below. The official report would later claim software glitches and automated safety protocols, but those in the room knew better. One junior technician whispered that it was like the signal wanted to hide itself, not from them, but from something else watching. His comment was met with silence. The hum from Antarctica was now strong enough to register on instruments meant for deep space, and yet every eye that could have seen its source was being guided away. Deep within the seismic archives, rows of locked servers held decades of recordings from stations scattered across the globe. When the Antarctic vibration began to intensify, a team was dispatched to search those archives for anything resembling its signature. Most found nothing, but one operator, working alone in a dim underground room, discovered something hidden far from the main directories. It was an unmarked file, dated decades earlier, its origin logged as unverified. The waveform within was eerily similar to the current pulse, though weaker, almost like a first whisper compared to the roar now shaking the bedrock. When he isolated the strongest moments of the recording, another pattern revealed itself. Not random peaks, but a repetition of tones that, when mapped, resembled the rise and fall of spoken words. The operator had once been a seminarian before joining the agency, and something about the rhythm pulled at old memories. He began matching the intervals to passages of ancient text and found a near-perfect alignment to a single verse. The stone, which the builders rejected, has become the cornerstone. As he played the clip again, the table beneath his hands seemed to hum in sympathy. The vibration was not limited to the recording. It was as if the very ground around him recognized the pattern and responded. The sensation grew until he could feel it in his chest, steady and deliberate, like the heartbeat of a giant sleeping beneath the earth. Word of his discovery spread quietly through the monitoring station. Some dismissed it as coincidence, the mind imposing meaning on random data. But others, especially those who had already seen the Nazarene's language embedded in earlier readings, felt the chill of recognition. It was not only a message, but a reminder, tied to a prophecy older than empires, one that spoke of a foundation stone placed by a divine hand. The pulse from Antarctica grew stronger still, and nearby stations began to pick it up without special equipment. Coffee mugs rattled on metal desks. Dust shifted from shelves. The earth itself seemed to lean into the verse, carrying it through stone and soil as if determined that nothing would silence it. In the operator's mind, the words repeated without end, not as a fragment from the past, but as something being spoken again, right now, beneath the ice. Dr. Elias Marrow had spent most of his life chasing patterns hidden in the noise of the earth. His reputation was built on precision, on an unshakable commitment to data over belief. When the Antarctic readings were sent to him for independent review, he approached them with the same detached discipline that had earned him the trust of governments and research institutions. At first, he treated the signal as a rare geophysical event, perhaps a deep mantle anomaly or the long decay of some ancient tectonic stress. But as he layered the data into his custom analysis software, something began to unsettle him. The vibration was not random. It pulsed in a way that seemed aware, shifting subtly whenever he adjusted his filters, as though it were answering his intrusion. He tested it over and over, each time altering his parameters. Each time the signal shifted just enough to remain in perfect resonance. It was as if it was not being observed. It was observing him. Then came the moment he could not explain. Late at night, alone in his lab, he converted the frequency into audible range. Through his speakers came a sound so pure it seemed to vibrate the air itself. Beneath it, layered so faintly it was almost imagined, was a voice. He could not make out the words, but they carried a tone that was not pleading or commanding, simply knowing. The next morning, he erased the conversion from his system. He told no one. When the agency pressed him for his final report, he wrote only that the phenomenon was inconclusive and that further study was not advised. It was the first time in his career he had ever withheld a finding. Privately, in a notebook no one would see, he wrote something entirely different. He described a presence within the vibration, one that felt as old as the earth, but somehow reaching toward something beyond it. He admitted that for the first time in his life the data had made him feel small, not as a scientist, but as a man. When asked later why he had refused to publish, he simply said some patterns were not meant to be mapped, because the moment they are fully understood, the one they are seeking will have already been found. The data lab was built without windows, its walls lined with cables and cooling units that kept the racks of servers alive in a constant artificial hum. Here, every reading from the Antarctic array was fed into algorithms designed to translate seismic vibrations into visual graphs. Most of the time, the output looked like chaotic waves or irregular peaks. But during one midnight cycle, the system produced something else entirely. On the central monitor, the incoming vibration began to align in ways no one had programmed. Peaks flattened, valleys deepened, and over the course of 7 minutes, the chaotic lines resolved into a clear geometric shape. It was unmistakable, a cross, not perfect in symmetry, but formed with deliberate intent. The technician on duty thought it was a software glitch until he ran the raw input through 3 separate systems. Each one produced the same image. It wasn't embedded in the code, it was in the vibration itself. The Earth was drawing. When the image was enhanced, faint secondary lines appeared around the cross, suggesting a halo of light radiating from its center. This detail was never part of any seismic pattern they had recorded before. It looked less like data and more like something pulled from the margins of an illuminated manuscript. A linguist on the night shift was called in to see it. She stared at the image in silence for a long time before speaking. Her grandfather had once been a priest, and she remembered his words about signs, not as superstition, but as messages for those willing to listen. In the quiet hum of the lab, she whispered a verse she had not recited in years. "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." The others in the room said nothing. No one wanted to admit what they were thinking, that the pulse beneath the Antarctic ice was not only speaking, but revealing. The shape remained stable on the monitor for exactly 9 minutes before dissolving back into unreadable noise. It began as an anomaly in maritime reports. Ships crossing the Southern Ocean sent in routine updates to navigation authorities, but scattered among them were strange notes, observations of a sea that had gone unnaturally calm. Waves that should have been fierce under the screaming Antarctic winds flattened into glass. Swells halted mid-crest, lingering before settling without breaking. Satellite buoys confirmed it. At precise intervals matching the Antarctic vibration, surface motion readings dropped to 0, not slowed, stopped. The ocean itself seemed to hold its breath. In the control rooms where the global oceanic data streamed in, operators watched in disbelief as entire sections of wave mapping grids went still. The readings formed perfect circles expanding outward from the coordinates of the buried chamber beneath the ice. These rings traveled for hundreds of miles, touching coasts where fishermen swore the tide itself had forgotten to move. Somewhere in the Pacific, a deep-sea research vessel recorded the moment on high-sensitivity hydrophones. The pulse that reached them was low, resonant, and impossibly even. It was not the chaotic roar of natural seismic activity. It was a sustained tone, one that held steady for minutes before fading. The lead scientist aboard the vessel played it back in the mess hall that night. Crew members sat in silence as the sound rolled through the speakers. One of them, a man raised in an island village where stories were passed by song, said the tone reminded him of an ancient chant used to call storms into submission. His grandfather had told him the chant was not meant for men, but for the sea itself, to remind it of the voice it once obeyed. The resonance deepened as the days passed. It reached the Indian Ocean, then the South Atlantic, always carrying that strange, steady authority. Divers off the coast of Chile reported feeling it in their chests, a vibration that seemed to match their own heartbeat. In some places, old harbors grew eerily quiet. Gulls circled in silence. Fishermen lowered nets into water that was so still it reflected the sky like polished obsidian. The stillness never lasted long, minutes, sometimes less, but it always returned, as if keeping a schedule only the pulse knew. And every time it did, the ocean seemed to remember something they had not felt in an age. It began just before dawn, when the Antarctic listening post registered a spike unlike any before. The pulse, which had been steady and measured for weeks, suddenly surged, climbing in intensity until it maxed out every instrument on the array. Lights flickered in the control room, monitors distorted, and the concrete floor itself seemed to hum. Across the world, the effects rippled outward. In coastal towns, the sea drew back unnaturally far, revealing seabeds that had not seen daylight in centuries. In deep valleys, animals went still, their ears twitching toward a sound no human ear could detect. Somewhere in the high desert, a man awoke from a dream of a voice calling his name and found the same vibration in the air around him. Back at the ice chamber, the expedition team felt it strongest. The ground beneath them resonated so powerfully that their teeth rattled. Instruments left unattended began to shift across tabletops. The void they had drilled into seemed to breathe, exhaling air so cold it burned, yet carrying with it a strange scent, metallic, ancient, almost like rain on stone. Then the tone began to change. It climbed in pitch, shedding the deep hum for something sharper, purer. The team's sensors recorded a pattern in the shift, a narrowing of frequency bands that converged on one exact point. The reading was so precise that it could not be random. The vibration was no longer searching. It had found its target. Far from Antarctica, in places the team would never see, clocks began to lose sync by fractions of a second. In hidden military bunkers, communication arrays lit up with untraceable interference. And somewhere in a quiet city street, a single street lamp flickered in time with the pulse. Inside the ice chamber, the pitch reached its peak. The walls seemed to drink in the sound, amplifying it until the air itself felt solid. Every member of the team froze, unable to speak, their eyes drawn to the void below as though something were about to rise from it. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the vibration stopped. No fading, no echo, only silence. A silence so complete it seemed to press against the ears, heavier than any noise. The instruments showed nothing. The ground lay still. Yet every person who had heard it knew the same thing. This was not the end. It was the pause before whatever came next.
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.